Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to another episode of Grow Food SA. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about planting in container plants. And that's a little bit different from planting in a raised bed or soil. So we're going to discuss a little bit of the differences and kind of how to plan accordingly for that. So there's many reasons why you might want to consider growing in a container. So if you're limited on your space and you don't have access to soil on the ground, say you're on a balcony or you live in an apartment complex, you only have a window seal, you only have a front porch, things like that, might be reasons why you want to grow into a container, especially if you're maybe only got 6 months of a lease and you're going to be moving frequently. Other issues could be things like if you're growing citrus that might need to be taken to a greenhouse during freezes and things like that. You'd want to be able to move the container to another location, or say the sun is really difficult and you just got to move the plant around in the sun. It's really a specialty kind of plant, so you maybe want to experiment with different shades of light before you plant it. So there's many reasons to start using containers, but here's a couple of examples of just really the versatility of containers. Really, you can go to the store and you can buy plastic ones. These are the cheaper ones. You can go and buy some clay ones. These start to get expensive. Always look for discounts and deals on those. But then you can also just start growing in various containers that you have. These are old kegs. I've even made some out of extra concrete that I had by taking 2 plastic containers and putting them into a container, fill it with concrete, and then put in the smaller plastic container to kind of fill that up. So there's really a lot of possibilities that we have here. We can do it in this big cooking pot here. Basically anything that'll hold the material in place and allow you to plant in it. So here's just like a little drawer that you're able to plant in, and here's another example of sort of this pot that I made. So with all these examples, one of the only things you need to make sure that you do is that you always have a hole in it or a couple of ways for water to run out. Drainage is one of the most important issues about planting in a container. We don't have to normally worry about that in the soil because as the soil gets saturated enough, it just sort of goes all the way down into the deeper parts of the soil and drains out through there. But with containers, it can sit on the bottom of the container, so we definitely need to always remember to make sure that there's holes in there. Use something, a drill bit, to kind of drill holes in these containers here. So these need to be prepared with holes in them. So drill bits, you can puncture it with some sharp object. You can even take, if it's plastic sometimes, like heat up a rod in a fire or on the stove top and then put the metal rod through there. That'll melt through the plastic and make holes in it. But there's really a lot of options that you can do to grow. So if the container is going to be indoors, you always got to remember that hole, you might want a little bit of a tray for it so that this doesn't get all over your furniture or all over the shelf. But also keep in mind, that maybe you want this sitting up a little bit because you want that water to drain out. If it sits in this tray, it's going to get pulled right back up in there. So this is almost like having it sit in water. So this doesn't really allow the best drainage. Really, it's best if the container is sitting up on a couple of rocks and it can sit above the water as it drains out, so that we're almost just acting kind of hydroponically. Water comes in, saturates the soil holds as much water as it can hold, and then it lets out the rest of the water. That's really important. So after you add in all of those mixes, one of the important things that kind of has to happen with container gardens is you really need to make sure that you have nutrients in there, because it's really not going to get its nutrients from the plant cycle process that we normally talk about whenever you're working with soil and you're regenerating nutrients. Some of the compost will have nutrients, but you can also add various nutrients like Dolomite limestone. There's soybean blood meal, bone meal, There's green sand, which basically is harvested from the ocean floor that has nutrients in it. There's rock phosphate that helps promote root growth. And there's kelp or seaweed, which can be high in nitrogen, which can, if you notice your plant is maybe looking a little yellow, that can be a nitrogen deficiency. So these are all kinds of things that you want to try to balance in there. Whenever you buy a soil mix, a potting mix usually is what you're looking for. You don't want to use a garden soil in your potting mixes. You want to specifically look, if you are going to buy a pre-made one, you need to look for a potting soil mix. And those will have those nutrients already in there. But today we're going to be, the most easiest way and most affordable way is to kind of make your own. So we're going to be exploring that a little bit today. There's two kinds of mixes that you can make. There's a soilless mix that's often just 50% peat moss, 50% perlite, but that one really doesn't have any soil in it, doesn't have any nutrients in it, so you really have to go hard and add a lot of fertilizers and nutrients into that kind of mix. And there's all different ones online on how to make those mixes and balances, all different kinds of nutrients and fertilizers that you can kind of find. Some might be available already in your house, or some might be available at the nursery, or you might have to look online. The other mix that we'll be talking about today is really about almost the same, but it's a soil mix. So this one's going to have 1 part perlite, 1 part peat moss, and then 1 part compost. And you can either do compost, or you can do like old container mixes. You can mix that into there. You can do, if you did buy like a topsoil or a garden soil bag, you can mix that in with the perlite and the peat moss or the coco coir, and that'll kind of make a really good mix. That compost is what's really going to have those nutrients in there. You can add additional nutrients in there, rock phosphates, limestones, seaweed, kelp, things like that, bone meal, blood meal. Those are all like really important things to kind of add in your potting mixes if you get the opportunity to. But I've grown successfully without having to do a lot of those mixes in the initial batch. And often what you'll have to do is, if you notice the plant is maybe not doing so well, then you can add in liquid fertilizers afterwards whenever you're watering, or onto the top, and those will kind of go on through. You could add those weekly. So one of the first items that you'll see in a lot of potting mixes that looks like styrofoam is actually kind of a popped rock. So this comes from a popped or a volcanic rock, and you can't really see it that well, but it's got these tiny little pores in it, and that allows air to get trapped in there. That sometimes water can get trapped in there, nutrients can get trapped in there, but mostly this is used for aeration. This little rock right here, see, I can almost crush that. That contains little bits of oxygen in it, and that's a really important part of the soil in container gardens, is because there's really not much oxygen moving through there, and it's only through the top and through that hole on the bottom. So this helps circulate oxygen and keep oxygen in there. One of the other ones that comes from a volcanic material is vermeculite. This kind of can hold water, it can do hold moisture a little bit, but it also can hold some air and nutrients. This has extra potassium and manganese in it too, so it's a little bit of a nutrient. The next kind of common one is peat moss. There's coco coir, sphagnum moss. This really helps absorb water. So if you're needing a mix that's a little bit heavier in water, like maybe the plant is sort of more of a swampier kind of plant, likes a little bit of a boggy water, doesn't like to dry out as much, you can go a little bit heavier on the peat moss. If you really want to make sure that there's oxygen in there, then and you want the water to drain out quickly, then really what you do is you do things like this perlite, or you would add in sand. So sand is another aggregate. So these two are aggregates. They kind of help store water and air in the soil, and that's really important. This one actually is more known for storing and grabbing onto water. And then our last one is just compost. So this one still needs to decompose, but it's very similar to this, you know, it's just made out of other organic material. The problem sometimes with peat moss is it's got a different pH balance that can be kind of difficult to work with. If a certain plant likes acidity, like maybe you're growing blueberries, then it's okay to do a lot of peat moss. You'd maybe want to do like 50% or more peat moss in your mix. But most plants don't really like a high acidity, so we try to stay away from peat moss. And plus it's not really sustainable, you know, it takes years to make, and then they'll harvest it really fast. So the more sustainable option is coco coir, which is just kind of a pulp that can be ground up, that's very, very much similar to this. Another option is just using your compost. So this will have available nutrients in it, and it's also kind of got thick aggregates that allow air to move through, and some of it can also hold water too. But this is really good because it also has nutrients that are just breaking down in this leaf matter as it starts to form. So here's my mix that I'm making today. I got my perlite right here. I got peat moss, or you can use coco coir. I got compost, that's right here. And then I added in a little bit of rock limestone dust. And there's a little bit of the vermeculite in there. So this is my standard kind of growing mix for pots and things like that. And this will work for some vegetables and things like that as well. So always kind of keep in mind too, if you pull out the container, look at what soil's in that container. That can sometimes indicate what you might need. A lot of the other things that we kind of didn't talk about a lot in today too was, you know, adding sand. So sand can be thrown into the mix, especially if it needs to drain quickly. So we're talking about things that can't sit in boggy water. So succulents, cactuses, things like that really need a high sand mix. So we would add another part of this would be just a good chunk of sand in there. This mix is going to be made to hold both of these elements right here are going to hold water. And again, this is our air element. So air, water, holding water, and then nutrients over here. And if we needed more air and more drainage, then again, we can use that sand like that. Yeah, so look at that mix. That looks really good. And really what you want is you want something that's really light. You'll notice that compared to like a garden soil, that this is really, really light. You know, so this has a lot of air already in it. And as we said, those other elements are going to be able to hold some of that water in there. But we really want something that, you know, it's almost like a hydroponic thing. You want it to, the water just to flush on through. You want the water to stick to wherever it can, but then flow on out. So since we're going to be growing vegetables or fruit in one of these containers here, we're going to try to go ahead and get something that has a lot of nutrients in it. So I still like to make my own mixes, but every once in a while, especially if it's something like fruits, then I really want to make a really hearty mix, because I'm not going to be able to always be adding nutrients into that, and I want to make sure that there's nutrients in here. So this one I went ahead and bought. This was a Fox Farms coco coir blend. So the majority of this really was things like let's see, so coco coir aged forest product, perlite, and fertilizers, you know. And then almost the rest of this list here, it just goes through and it's all these things: earthworm castings, bat guano, oyster shells, Dolomite lime. So you can really see the last part of all this is really nutrient heavy, and what we get is this substance here that's got, you could see a lot of that perlite in there, you know. That's to provide that oxygen in there. And then just look how dark this is, you know. We know this is nutrient rich. So I use a lot of those whenever I'm planting fruits and vegetables. So if you're going to be growing in a larger container like this, so this is a full keg that was cut out to grow in, then is a time that maybe you want to use rocks down at the bottom. So I got my drainage hole right here, and I want to make sure that that stays clear. So that's why I kind of put some rocks over it. Often, if the container is a lot smaller, I don't recommend putting rocks in there. As long as you got enough holes on the bottom of the container, it'll drain properly. Rocks will only take up space. So I'm only using rocks in this scenario because I have a lot of space to fill. And actually what's going to happen is I'm going to put a layer of rocks down there for drainage. And then I'm also just going to fill most of it up with organic matter. And I'm only really going to, let's see, maybe about that much with organic matter. And then out here I'll put in my potting mix that's about somewhere around here. So, you know, I don't have to fill this whole thing up with potting soil because that's going to be really expensive. My root zone of my plant is mainly going to be right here. The rest of the organic matter will break down over the next couple years, almost just like as if you were doing sheet mulching. You know, you can apply that layering process into a potted container. But the only thing you got to keep in mind is that you really want your soil layer to be a lot thicker in this example, because this is going to be the initial soil that we're going to be plotting in, and we really need to make sure that we have enough space for all the roots. Example of that is like this large container that has bananas in it, a couple of these containers with blackberries, miracle berries, a small cherry. We really, you know, have to think about this a lot with citruses, blueberries, you know, as we talked about with this mix, really better on the peat moss because we want that pH balance to go a little bit higher, and more citrus, limes here. So these I really had to use a strong nitrogen mix, or a strong nutrient mix I should say, because there's other nutrients in there besides nitrogen. But again, if you don't have that initially, you can go ahead and try to plant in it. Just get your compost in there, and then you can always add nutrients in. So as we talked about, you know, if you're going to grow something that's like vegetable based, this has to grow. Organic plant food really works well. There's other things, you know, if you're just growing flowers, then the nutrients that you want to get are a little bit different, but still available out there.